First Book of Grasses by Agnes Chase, published 1922 by the Macmillan Company. Preface. Of all plants, grasses are the most important to man. The different kinds are known by very few, even among botanists. This is because they are supposed to be very difficult. When the structure of grasses is clearly understood, they are not more difficult to study than are other plants. The method here offered has been used by the author for some years in teaching special students. The introduction explains the method followed. The body of the primer consists of 12 lessons graded from the simplest to the most complex. Each lesson is accompanied by figures bringing out the facts in the text. The difference in the size of the flowering organs is so great that the figures are not drawn to the same scale. The organs are enlarged as much as necessary to illustrate the character discussed. Grasses of the United States are used for the lessons, and the commoner ones are selected so far as possible. However, our native grasses cover so wide a range that the principles laid down in the lessons are applicable to grasses generally. Introduction. The purpose of this primer is to give those with little or no knowledge of botany such an understanding of the structures of grasses as will enable them to use manuals of botany and other technical works, to the end that our native grasses may become better known and their worth and beauty be more fully appreciated. The best method of studying any organism is to observe and examine the organisms themselves. Since these cannot be provided in a book, drawings of the object studied are here offered as the best substitute. These drawings are purposely somewhat diagrammatic in order to bring out particular characters that may be less prominent in the actual plants. While the drawings convey clearer ideas of the structure than can words, and are to be used constantly with the text, they can but inadequately take the place of the plants themselves. The student, therefore, should collect for study as many different types of living grasses as possible. The idea of a primer has been kept in mind. The subject is presented as simply as possible, and only enough grasses are examined in each lesson to illustrate the different modifications and to prepare students to comprehend the greater modifications shown in subsequent lessons. The classification of grasses, that is, the grouping together of related forms, is based on the characters of the aggregate of minute flowers and bracts known as the spikelet. It is necessary, therefore, for anyone who wishes to be able to identify a given grass to understand the structure and modifications of the spikelet. This primer is really an elementary study of the morphology of the spikelet. Morphology is a branch of science that treats of form and structure. The study of morphology of the spikelet enables one to recognize its various organs under whatever form they may assume. Use of technical terms. Many persons who might otherwise make an effort to learn something about our common wild flowers and trees, as well as grasses, are deterred by the sight of unfamiliar words used in botanical descriptions. This supposed lion in the way, if one will but draw near enough to see, is only a harmless, necessary cat. No boy learns a trade. No girl learns to sew without learning the names of the tools used. Words, like names, whippletree, terrets, and 100 more, meaningless to the city-bred rider on a trolley car, are familiar terms to the farmer. Footnote. Mark Twain's description in A Tramp Abroad of how they hitch horses in Europe is a good example of the confusion caused by want of technical terms. Quote, "The man stands up from horses on each side of the thing that projects from the front end of the wagon, throws the gear on top of the horses, and passes the thing that goes forward through a ring and hauls it aft, and passes the other thing through the other ring and hauls it aft on the other side of the other horse opposite to the first one. After crossing them and bringing the loose end back, and then buckles the other thing underneath the horse, and takes another thing and wraps it around the thing I spoke of before, and puts another thing over each horse's head, and puts the iron thing in its mouth, and brings the ends of these things aft over his back after buckling another one under his neck, and hitching another thing on a thing that goes over his shoulders, and then takes the slack of the thing which I mentioned a while ago, and fetches it aft, and makes it fast to the thing that pulls the wagon, and hands the other things up to the driver." Such terms as carburetor, accelerator, clutch, spark plug, or magneto, unknown a few years ago, are now understood by nearly everybody, and those who do not as yet understand these terms are by no means deterred thereby from buying or wishing for an automobile. Spikelet, glume, and lemma are words no more difficult to learn than are the names crupper or whippletree, carburetor, clutch, or magneto. The other reason for using these botanical terms is the same as for using the names of the different parts of the harness. They are simpler and more exact than would be a descriptive phrase. It is simpler to say terrets than to say the rings that stick up in the middle of the harness on the horse's back that you pass the reins through. And it is simpler to say glume when speaking of the organ of a grass than to say the little green scale on the outside of the thing with the seed in it. In the first lesson, nearly all the new words that a study of grasses will require are explained and illustrated by figures. The few additional terms necessary are explained as they are used. No attempt is made to write a primer on grasses in words of one syllable, nor to produce a work on how to know the grasses without any mental effort. It cannot be done. Use of Latin names. Besides unfamiliar terms, there are unfamiliar Latin names of the plants which some hesitate to encounter, but many of the names in common use for trees and herbs are the botanical names. Magnolia, rhododendron, petunia, asparagus, chrysanthemum, phlox are the Latin botanical names and are freely used without hesitation. Panicum, paspalum, bromus, festuca, hordeum are no more difficult. As in the case of such terms as glume and lemma, the Latin names of plants are used for the sake of exactness. Common names of plants, especially of those which are useful, troublesome, or conspicuous, are more definitely applied in older countries where the inhabitants have dwelt in a region for many generations than they are with us. Our ancestors brought the names of Old World plants with them to their new homes, and applied them to plants something like the familiar ones. Consequently, many common names are used in different parts of the country for widely different plants. In Illinois, June grass is Kentucky bluegrass, Poa pratensis, a valuable pasture grass. In Maine, June grass is Danthonia spicata, an almost worthless little relative of wild oats, and in parts of the West, it is Caleria cristata. The name blue joint is used for three very unlike grasses. On the other hand, many plants have different names in separate parts of the country. Around Washington, D.C., for example, azalea is commonly called honeysuckle. Many economic plants, such as potato, turnip, and rye, have common names uniform in any one language, but different in distinct languages. When the Latin name of a plant is used, it is definitely understood not only throughout the United States, but throughout the world, what species it refers to. However, the primary reason for using the botanical names is that these indicate the relationship of the plants. All plants of a kind have the same genus or generic name. Genus is the singular, genera the plural, generic the adjective. Kentucky bluegrass and all of its kind are Poa, P. pratensis, P. trivialis, P. annua, P. sandbergii, and so on. The common names of these, Kentucky bluegrass or June grass or rough meadowgrass, speargrass, little bunch grass, respectively, give no clue to their relationship or kind. Knowing Poa pratensis, anyone hearing of any grass named Poa has an idea of what it is like. It is something like Poa pratensis. Some common names, especially those of trees, indicate the kind. Oak, with black, white, scarlet, swamp, and post oak, for example, and also hickory and ash. But for herbs, and especially grasses, the common name usually gives no indication of the kind of plant it refers to. Often, the name is misleading. Ribgrass is not a grass, but a plantain. Poison ivy is not an ivy, but a sumac. To convey different ideas, we must use definite terms and definite names. Tools needed. Any work that one engages requires tools. For the study of grasses, we need but few. Grass flowers are too small to be seen distinctly with the naked eye. A lens magnifying 10 diameters is necessary. This may be mounted on a stand, or it may be a hand lens. A simple dissecting microscope with 2 or 3 lenses of different magnification would be more convenient, and would well repay the cost, but is not absolutely necessary. If one has only a hand lens, an eyepiece, such as watchmakers place in the eye, will also be found very useful in dissecting, as it leaves both hands free. 1 or 2 dissecting needles are needed. These can be made by forcing the heads of coarse sewing needles into a pencil-shaped piece of soft wood, After some practice, one learns to use the nail of the left forefinger skillfully in dissecting. One can work more rapidly with this and one needle than with a pair of needles. A scalpel is useful, but the small sharp blade of a penknife will answer instead. It is well to have a piece of black paper or cardboard on which to place hairy spikelets. The hairs on the different parts show up well against this background. It is the aim to use, so far as possible, the characters that may be seen in the different parts of the spikelet with but little dissection. When further dissection is necessary, instructions will be given at the end of the lesson requiring it. Lesson 1. The Grass Family. To most persons, grass is almost any green vegetation of rather low growth, especially such as may be grazed. To the student of plants, a grass is a member of the natural family of Poaceae, or Gramineae, distinguished by its structure. Grasses are herbs with round or flattened, never three-angled, usually hollow stems, culms, solid at the joints, nodes, and two-ranked, alternate parallel veined leaves composed of two parts, the sheath, which surrounds the culm like a tube split down one side, and the blade, which is usually strap-shaped, flat, folded, or with rolled margins. At the junction of the sheath and the blade, on the inside, is a small appendage, the ligule, and this is commonly thin in texture. Sometimes it is only a ring of hairs, rarely is it obsolete. The plants may be annual or perennial. The root, stem, and leaves are the vegetative part of the plant, see Figure 1. These are all that are concerned with the life of the individual plant. The flowers have to do with perpetuating the species. In grasses, the vegetative parts are more uniform and characteristic than in most other families. Having stem and leaves of any plant, it can be always readily decided whether or not it is a grass. The only plants that may be reasonably mistaken for grasses are the sedges. In these, the culms are solid or pithy and are not jointed, and are commonly three-sided. The leaves are always three-ranked, and the sheaths always closed. The flowers of grasses are small and inconspicuous. They consist of a single pistil with one-celled, one-ovuled ovary, two styles, each with a feathery stigma, and three, rarely one or six, stamens with delicate filaments and two-celled anthers. Two minute scales called loticules, situated back of the pistil at blooming time, become turgid and force open the enveloping scales. In Figure 2 are shown the parts of a common flower. The wild prairie rose with long styles, the calyx and corolla are the floral envelopes. The stamens and pistils are the essential organs of the flower, the parts that produce seed. The floral envelopes protect the essential organs in the bud, and by secreting nectar, which attracts insects, or, in other ways, commonly aid in securing the fertilization of the flower. The pistil consists of the ovary, style, and stigma. The ovary contains the ovules, which when fertilized develop into the seeds. The style serves to lift the stigma into the air. The stigma is more or less expanded and has a viscid surface to which the pollen grains adhere and upon which they germinate, sending their contents into a minute tube which pushes down through the style to the ovules, fertilizing them. The grass flower, Figure 3, is reduced to the essential organs, the floral envelopes being represented by the minute loticules. Each flower is borne in the axil of a small green bract, the lemma, and is subtended and enveloped in a second bract, the palea. The flower with its lemma and palea is termed the floret, Figure 4. The ripened ovary, the grain, or caryopsis, Figure 5, consists of a small embryo lying at the base of a mass of starchy endosperm. Endosperm means within the sperm or seed. It is the store of food used by the infant plantlet when it begins to grow. The germ of a kernel of corn is the embryo, while the remainder of the kernel is starchy endosperm. The grain lies in the palea within the hilum, the scar of the point of attachment toward it, and the embryo on the side towards the lemma. Figure 5 gives two views of a grain, one showing the hilum, the other the embryo. In Figure 81, on page 91, are two kernels of corn showing the embryos. The grain, with very few exceptions, is permanently enclosed in the lemma and palea, the mature floret being the fruit, that is, the seed with its permanent envelopes. The florets are borne in two ranks, and alternate upon an axis, the racula. Below them are two bracts without flowers, the glumes. The glumes, racula, and florets together form the spikelet. Figure 6 is a diagram of a branch with two leaves and flowers arranged as are the glumes, lemmas, pallias, and flowers of a grass spikelet. Figure 7 is a diagram of a spikelet for comparison with Figure 6. The hypothetical flower-bearing branchlet is never elongate, as shown here for the sake of comparison. The pallia is immediately above the lemma, and the flower immediately above the pallia. It will be seen that the spikelet is theoretically a leafy flowering branch with jointed main axis. The flowers, except for the minute loticules, reduce to the essential organs. In Figure 8, a typical grass spikelet is shown. The lemmas and pallias nearly close together in concealing the flowers. The spikelet is characteristic of grasses and is not found in any other family except that of the sedges. In the spikelets of sedges, the florets are commonly, but not always, spirally arranged, and never is a pallia. The fruit is an achene or nutlet. The seeds of buttercups and mints are achenes or nutlets. In grasses, specialization takes place mostly in the spikelet. By its vegetative characters, we know a given plant to be a grass, but it is by the spikelets and their arrangement that we know what kind of grass it is. The genera of grasses and the groups of genera called tribes are based on the structure of the spikelets and their arrangements in the inflorescence. Before studying the spikelet, we must observe the relatively few specializations of vegetative parts. As in other plants, stems or parts of stems may be underground. These underground stems, or rhizomes, or rootstocks, are born at the base of the main culm under the earth, spread out horizontally, and in due time send up shoots which form young plants at a distance from the parent. Sod-forming grasses have this kind of underground stem. Kentucky bluegrass, Poa pratensis, Figure 9, furnishes an excellent example. Sometimes the rhizome is thick and woody, sending up shoots from its nodes, the whole forming a dense colony, as in gamma grass, Tripsacum dactylides. A rhizome, being a stem, is jointed and bears scales, which are reduced leaves. By these, it may always be distinguished from a root, which is not jointed and never bears scales. In some grasses, the shoots born at the base of the culm are on the surface of the earth instead of beneath it. Such shoots are called stolons, or runners. These, like rhizomes, are jointed and bear scales, or sometimes well-developed leaves. Rhizomes and stolons both bear roots on the underside of the nodes. In a few species, Bermuda grass for one, a plant may produce either rhizomes or stolons according to the conditions under which it is growing. There is no real difference between a rhizome and a stolon. The one is below the ground and colorless, the other above ground and green. Culms are hollow in most grasses, but in corn, sugarcane, sorghum, and related grasses they are pithy. They may be erect, spreading, or creeping. They may be simple or freely branching. A branch is born only at a node in the axil of a sheath, that is, between the sheath and the culm. It either grows up in parallel with the parent culm until it emerges from the sheath, or the young branch splits the sheath and grows outward. In manuals of botany, these two methods of branching are called intravaginal, that is, inside the vagina, Latin for sheath, and extravaginal, inside the sheath. In bunch grasses like orchard grass and the wheat grass of the West, the branching is intravaginal. In Kentucky bluegrass, quackgrass, and others producing rhizomes or stolons, the branching is extravaginal. The branches born in the middle and upper nodes of a culm are nearly always intravaginal. If they are spread from the parent culm, they do not burst through the sheath, but carry it with them. Leaves are always born at the nodes and are always two-ranked. See Figure 1, page 9. In corn and other large grasses, the leaves sometimes appear to be all on one side instead of two-ranked. This is due to a twisting of the culm inside the sheath. Sometimes in large grasses, particularly in sugarcane and bamboo, the leaves fall, leaving the culm naked. In relatively few grasses, the edges of the sheath are grown together, forming a tube. Sometimes the blade of the leaf is not developed. This is always the case in the leaves or scales of the rhizomes, Figure 9, and often of those stolons and lowermost leaves of a culm, especially in bamboos. Blades may be flat or folded, often called conduplicate, or involute, that is, rolled lengthwise. Rarely, the inrolled edges are grown together, so that the blade really has no upper surface. Such leaves are called terete, meaning rounded. Blades vary greatly in size, shape, and texture, smoothness or hairiness. In broad leaves there is sometimes a narrow neck or petiole, leaf stalk, between the sheath and the blade. Summary. Grasses are distinguished by jointed, round, or flattened, usually hollow, culms with solid nodes, two ranked leaves composed of sheath and blade, with a ligule at their junction, and by the spikelets with two ranked glumes and florets. Review questions. 1. How is a grass distinguished from all other plants? 2. Break a cornstalk and note the arrangement of the torn fibers standing out of the pith. Compare this with the cut end of any twig of a tree or shrub. Cut across a wheat, oat, or rye straw and compare the cornstalk with the twig. 3. Examine the culm, nodes and internodes, above and below ground, and leaves, sheath, ligule, and blade, of any available grass. 4. How is a rhizome distinguished from a root? 5. What is the difference between a rhizome and a stolon? Lesson 2. The spikelet and the inflorescence. Theoretically, the spikelet is a reduced leafy branch. In the generalized spikelet shown in Figure 8, the likeness of a jointed culm with two ranked leaves, Figure 1, is readily seen. The glumes and the lemmas corresponding to the sheaths, their blades not developed. The palea, with two nerves and with its back to the axis, corresponds to a minute bract, the profilum, born at the base of a branch in the axil of a sheath. The profilum is always two-nerved, with its back, that is, the space between the nerves, against the main axis and its margins clasping the young branch. The flower, also, is theoretically an ultimate branchlet. In the flower-bearing lemmas, therefore, the palea is developed, while in the glumes, bearing no flowers, there are no paleas. Glumes and lemmas are, morphologically, reduced leaves. The lower pair, not flower-bearing, being termed glumes, the flower-bearing ones being called lemmas. See Figure 7. The jointed axis of the spikelet, the rachilla, corresponds to the jointed culm and, like it, usually breaks the nodes, the internode, the part of the rachilla between two nodes, remaining attached to the floret at its base, Figure 4. Just as in a broken grass stem, the internode of the culm remains with the sheath that surrounds it. That is, the break normally comes just under the node. Rachis, which means the spine or backbone, and axis, the imaginary central line of any body, are often used interchangeably as botanical terms. In more recent works on grasses, and in these lessons, axis is used for the main axis of a compound inflorescence, rachis for the axis or support of the spikelets. In Figure 10 are shown the axis of a panicle, A, and the rachis of a raceme, B. The rachis of the spike, C, is concealed by the overlapping spikelets. Spikelets are born pedicled, that is, on a pedicle or footstalk, or sessile without a pedicle. In the leafless panicles, racemes, or spikes, Figure 10, these different types of inflorescence insensibly grade into each other. The axis and branches of a panicle and the rachis of a raceme, or spike, may be as elaborately modified and specialized as may be the parts of a spikelet. The axis, rachis, or branches may be continuous, not jointed, or articulate, jointed, and usually disarticulating, breaking up. The breaking up takes place at definite points and has to do with the scattering of the seed. The point of the disarticulation is the same in grasses of the same kind, or genus, and is usually alike in related genera, and for this reason is of great importance in the classification of grasses. When there are no joints in the axis or branches, the disarticulation comes in the spikelet, either above the glumes and between the florets, or below the glumes. Modifications of these two ways of disarticulating will be met with later. The study of the form of inflorescence and the modification of its parts will be carried on together with that of the spikelet. Summary. A spikelet consists of glumes and florets in two ranks and alternate on the rachilla, the florets consisting of a lemma, palea, and the enclosed flower, Every organ found in the most specialized spikelet is found to be interpreted as an elaboration or a reduction of one of these parts. The spikelet is the unit of inflorescence. The floret is the unit of the spikelet. The spikelet is always simple, that is, the rachilla never branches. The floret is always one-flowered, with never more than one lemma and one palea. The glumes and florets are always alternate, two consecutive ones never being born one above the other. These basic facts kept in mind will aid in the recognition of complicated or congested spikelets and in the correct interpretation of their parts. Review. 1. Examine a spikelet of a brome grass, such as cheat or chess. Separate the florets from each other and from the glumes. Note that these disjoint without tearing. Open out the lemma and palea. Note that these permanently adhere at their base. They can only be torn or cut apart. 2. Name the parts of a spikelet. 3. What is their arrangement? 4. What is the difference between a rachis and a rachilla? Lesson 3. Modifications of the spikelet. Taking the generalized spikelet as a beginning, examine figures 4 and 8. Note that the glumes and lemmas have nerves or veins, fibrovascular bundles, running from the base of the apex, or nearly to it, one nerve in the middle and an equal number on each side, there being an odd number of nerves in the glume and the lemmas. In the palea, there are only 2 nerves, none in the middle. The modifications and variations of the spikelets will be studied as nearly as possible in order of their increasing complexity. No attempt should be made to fix in mind the forms of specialization here enumerated. This lesson is meant only to put one on the lookout for modifications so that one may be prepared to recognize a given organ under various guises. 1. Spikelets differ in size. Bromus or brome grass, meadow fescue, and bluegrass are examples. 2. The number of florets may be reduced to 1 or increased to 20 or more. 3. The parts of the spikelet vary in their relative sizes. The glumes may be large and the florets small, or the florets large and the glumes small. 4. The rachilla joints may be slender or thick, so short that the florets appear to be opposite, or nearly as long as the florets themselves. The node at the base of the floret, the callus, is sometimes prolonged into a sharp point. The uppermost rachilla joint may bear no floret and may extend into a little bristle. 5. The glumes may vary in shape, in texture, and in the number of the nerves, and may be glabrous, smooth, or pubescent, hairy. Sometimes they are reduced to rudiments, and sometimes they are suppressed. 6. The lemma is subject to great modifications that we shall now note only in the simplest terms. As in the glumes, the shape and the texture and the number of nerves vary. The summit of the lemma may be acute, pointed, or acuminate, long-pointed, or obtuse, blunt, or it may be lobed or cleft. The nerves may be faint or strong, and may extend into awns, bristles, beyond the body of the lemma. The lemma is sometimes minute, but it is never suppressed. 7. The palea is always 2-nerved, but in a few grasses the nerves are so close together as to appear like a single one. In others they are far apart and the palea may split between them. The palea differs in size and texture. In a few genera it is reduced or even suppressed. 8. Spikelets are compressed, flattened, laterally, sideways, as in figures 11 through 14, or dorsally, on the back as in figures 60 through 66. The side or back of a spikelet is recognized from the position of the florets on the rachilla. The palea side of the floret is always towards the rachilla. Taking this as the front of a floret, the back or dorsum is the back of the lemma. Spikelets with many florets, or those in which the glumes or lemmas are folded in the midnerve, are generally laterally compressed. Those with a single fertile floret and with convex, rounded glumes and lemma are generally dorsally compressed. 9. Spikelets are sometimes unisexual, of one sex, instead of perfect, having both stamens and pistil. The two kinds, pistilet, the ovule-producing, and staminate, pollen-producing, may be borne on a single plant, as in corn, with pistillate spikelets in the ear and staminate spikelets in the tassel, or in different plants, as in saltgrass and buffalo grass. Grasses with staminate and pistillate spikelets on the same plant are monoecious, which means dwelling in one house. Those with staminate and pistillate spikelets on different plants are dioecious, dwelling in two houses. The unisexual spikelets of a single species may be similar in appearance, or they may be very unlike, as in corn. 10. Some grasses with perfect spikelets bear in addition staminate spikelets or neuter spikelets, having neither stamens nor pistils. These additional spikelets may be similar in appearance to the perfect ones, or very unlike them. They are born in the same inflorescence as the perfect spikelets, and are usually paired with them. 11. The florets of a single spikelet may be of two kinds, perfect and sterile, the sterile being either staminate or neuter. In spikelets like those of figures 11 through 14, with several to many florets, the uppermost florets are commonly sterile, not perfecting seed, though they are like the fertile florets in appearance and have rudimentary stamens and pistils. In some grasses, the sterile florets are very different from the fertile ones and may be borne above or below them on the rachilla. The position of sterile florets in the spikelet is the same in large series of related grasses. Hence, it is of great importance in classifying genera. The type or modification of the sterile floret is also uniform within a genus and generally in related genera. It commonly consists of a lemma without a palea, but there may be a rudimentary or even a well-developed palea. These types of modifications we brought out and illustrated in the succeeding lessons. Summary. All spikelets are built on the same simple plan of two ranked florets with a pair of glumes at the base. The spikelet, as a whole, at each of its organs is subject to modification. The palea and one or both of the glumes may be suppressed. The lemma may be reduced, but is never suppressed. The position and type of modification of sterile florets are of particular importance in classification. The parts of a spikelet, however complex, are recognizable as rachilla, glumes, lemma, or palea. Lesson 4. Pedicled spikelets of few to many florets. Taking the spikelet of cheat or chess, Bromus secalinus, figure 11, as a starting point, we have one but little different from the diagrammatic spikelet, figure 8. Names incidentally mentioned should not be memorized. The lemmas are convex on the back, several nerved, two-toothed at the apex, and bear an on from between the teeth. The on is the midnerve extending beyond the body of the lemma. The rachilla joints are short, bringing the florets, figure 11b, close together. The articulation is above the glumes and between the florets. The palea is grown fast to the grain. All species of bromus have spikelets of this character, differing in size, texture, length of on, which may be much longer or reduced to a mucro, a minute point, or even suppressed, in being glabrous, as in cheat, or pubescent. The pubescence may cover the lemma, or be along the margins only. These differences distinguish the species. A genus is composed of one to many species having few to several important characters in common, and presumably descended from a common ancestor. Groups of species having less important characters in common form related genera. Festuca, figure 12, is related to bromus, having few to several flowered spikelets, disarticulating above the glumes and between the florets, and with several nerved lemmas. But the lemmas are on from the tip, or pointed only and not toothed, and the palea is not grown to the grain. A large number of grasses have laterally compressed spikelets of this general type, disarticulating above the glumes and between the few to many florets. They are sorted into genera and the genera separated from each other chiefly according to the modifications of the lemma. In Panicularia, figure 13, the lemmas are broad and obtuse with strong parallel nerves. In Poa, figure 14, the lemmas are keeled on the back and have 5 nerves converging toward the acute but never the ond apex. The species figured, Kentucky bluegrass Poa pratensis, and many others are villous, having soft curly hairs on the lower part of the midnerve, and the marginal nerves have a tuft of white cottony hairs at the base. But this pubescence is not found in all the species. In all the grasses mentioned so far, the spikelets are borne in panicles, see figure 10a. Spikelets, much like those of Panicularia, figure 13, but borne in a raceme and having ond lemmas, are found in Pleuropogon, shown in figure 10b. In these spikelets, the palea is crested or winged on the nerves, figure 15, showing a 3/4 view of a palea removed from the floret. Returning to figure 11, we note the midnerve of the lemma extending as an on beyond the minutely toothed apex. The midnerve and the 2 lateral nerves are well extended into ons in Triodia flava, figure 16, the floret seen from the back. The apex of the lemma is toothed, and the nerves are villous below. In figure 17, floret of Cotea papophoroides, opened out and seen from the back. The lemma is lobed, and 9 to 11 of its many nerves are extended into ons. After the foregoing, the spikelet and its parts will be recognized in most of the genera of the group having few to many flowered pedicled spikelets. As stated in Lesson 3, the florets in a single spikelet may be of 2 kinds. The simplest spikelet of this type is found in the reed, Phragmites communis. In this, the lowest floret is staminate or neuter, and its lemma is much longer than its other florets, figure 18a. In the perfect floret, figure 18b, it will be seen that the palea is much shorter than the lemma, and the rachilla bears copious long soft hairs, and that instead of disarticulating at its summit and remaining attached to the floret next below, it disarticulates at its base, remaining as a tiny feathery stem to the floret next above, its copious long hairs carrying the floret before the wind, dispersing the seed. The hairs are much more copious than shown in the figure. They are slighted to avoid obscuring the difference in the florets. Another spikelet with 2 kinds of florets is shown in figure 19, Melica mutica. In this, the lemmas of the upper florets are reduced in size, changed in shape, and contain no flower. 2 or 3 of them are crowded together in a little club-shaped body. In the species figured, this modification is more marked than in most of the species. In figure 20 is shown a side view of the florets of a spikelet of Paparphorum vaginatum, the glumes removed. The lowest floret is perfect. Its broad lemma is cut into many spreading ons, compare with figure 17. The 204 other florets are crowded on the very short rachilla and are sterile. Their lemmas are similar to that of the one fertile floret. The rachilla does not disarticulate, the sterile florets remaining perfectly attached to the fertile one, the numerous ons of all together forming a pappus-like crown, which carries the seed before the wind. Pappus is the down on the seed of a dandelion, thistle, or other plant of their family. Next, we shall examine the inflorescence of a grass having spikelets entirely of sterile florets in addition to spikelets of fertile florets. Examine figure 21a, Cynosurus cristatus, which shows a small part of the spike-like panicle. The spikelets are borne on minute pedicles on very short compound branches. The lower 1 to 3 spikelets of each branch are sterile, the lemmas containing no flowers. Figure 21b. The upper 1 to 3 spikelets are smaller and fertile. Figure 21c. When the bracts of the sterile spikelet are all alike empty, why are all but the lower pair called lemmas instead of glumes? In many cases, the nature of the modified organs can only be recognized by their correspondence to organs in the same relative position in allied but more simple forms. In all the spikelets examined so far, and in all but a very small number of grasses, the bracts above the lower pair are flower-bearing or have a palea, which indicates their structural identity. Corresponding parts in a modified spikelet are therefore regarded as lemmas. In the grass just examined, the sterile spikelets remain on the panicled branches after the fall of the ripened fertile florets from their glumes. In Figure 22a, a Chirodes aureum, is shown a fascicle of one fertile and 3 sterile spikelets of another grass. In this, the fascicles hang from the short, slender branches of a narrow panicle and disarticulate from them, falling entire. This is the first example we have had so far of disarticulating branches in the inflorescence. In the figure, the fascicle is seen from the inner face to show the fertile spikelet, which, from the outside, is nearly hidden by the sterile ones. Figure 22b shows a separate fertile spikelet. It will be seen that except for the glumes, the two forms are strikingly different. The fertile spikelet is reduced to one fertile and one rudimentary floret, both awned, while the sterile spikelets are many-flowered and awnless. We shall see, next, a grass having unisexual spikelets, see Lesson 3, page 23, the two forms borne on different plants, dioecious. In the group with relatively simple spikelets which we are now studying, there are no monoecious grasses. In Figure 23, as shown, the pistillate and staminate spikelets of the saltgrass Disticlis spicata. They differ but little in appearance and are both borne in narrow panicles. In Figure 24 are seen the strikingly diverse staminate and pistillate spikelets of another dioecious species, Scleropogon brevifolius. The lemmas of the staminate spikelet are merely pointed. Those of the pistillate spikelet bear 3 long, slender, twisted, spreading awns. The pistillate florets fall from the glumes as a whole, the rachilla not disarticulating between them, and roll before the wind as tiny tumbleweeds. Summary. The inflorescence and the 2 to several flowered spikelets of the brome grasses, blue grasses, and their relatives are comparatively simple. In a few genera, sterile spikelets are developed, and a few others, the spikelets are unisexual. Review. Collect specimens of orchard grass, meadow fescue, any species of brome grass, or of poa, or of any available grasses having laterally compressed, few to several flowered spikelets. Identify the different parts of the spikelets. Lemmas may be spread out for examination by cutting off the very base with a sharp knife or scalpel. Spikelets of tough or rigid texture, if soaked in water for a few minutes, may be dissected without tearing. If very tough or hard, boiling the spikelets in water with a little glycerin, a drop of glycerin to about a teaspoonful of water, will make them manageable and keep them from drying out during dissection. Lesson 5. Sessile spikelets in 2-sided spikes. Returning again to the spikelet of Bromus secalinus, Figure 11, we shall strike out in another direction. Differentiation between living beings does not follow a line, but radiates like waves following the falling of a pebble in the water, or rather, like waves of sound in all directions. Hence, we cannot follow an unbroken line in studying the increasing complexity of the inflorescence of grasses. We can only return to the center and start out on another line. Compare Figure 10, A and B, with C and with Figure 25, couchgrass or quackgrass, Agropyron repens. A raceme is a panicle reduced to its lowest terms. Eliminating the pedicles of the spikelets of a raceme, we have a spike, the spikelets set directly upon the rachis. In such an inflorescence, the rachis is usually more or less thickened. In Figure 25a, part of the spike is shown from the flat side of the spikelet. The rachis is jointed, and a spikelet is borne at each joint, alternating on opposite sides. The rachis is thickened, and the joints slightly hollowed on alternate sides. See Figure 25b, a diagrammatic illustration of the rachis seen from the edge with all but 2 spikelets removed. The spikelet is not very different from that of Bromus, Figure 11, and, as in that, the ripened florets fall from the glumes. In the group of grasses taken up in this lesson, the specialization is mostly in the rachis and in the position of the relatively simple spikelets. In Figure 26, a spikelet of cultivated wheat, Triticum aestivum, we have the same type of spikelet as in Figure 25, but with fewer and much plumper florets, with broader lemmas slightly toothed at the apex and with long awns that are scabrous, rough like a file, awns from the beard of wheat. The spikelets are borne on a jointed rachis as in Figure 25, Agropyron repens, but the joints are shorter, bringing the spikelets closer together and hiding the rachis. In this cultivated wheat, the florets do not readily fall from the glumes, but remain in the spike and the ripened grain is thrashed from them. This persistence of the lemma and palea has been fixed by selection and cultivation. In the closely related emmer, Triticum dicoccum, the rachis breaks at the joints, each joint remaining attached to the spikelet. Compare Figure 27, Lolium multiflorum, with Figure 25. Note that in Figure 25, the spikelets are borne flat side against the rachis, while in Figure 27, they stand with their edges against the rachis. The rachis itself is of the same type as that in Figure 25. The diagrammatic rachis with two spikelets seen edgewise, Figure 25b, is shown from the same position as Figure 27. In this, as in Agropyron, the rachis is continuous, not disarticulating, and the florets fall. If we separate a spikelet from the rachis, we find that the first glume, the one that would be against the rachis, is suppressed, the first floret lying directly against the rachis. In the single spikelet borne at the summit of the rachis, the first glume is developed and is about as large as the second. When but one glume is present, we know which glume it is, and which is suppressed by the position of the first floret, which is always above the first glume. When no glume is found below the first floret, it is obvious that it is the first glume which is suppressed. In Figure 28, Leptorus cylindricus, we have a greatly thickened, strongly nerved rachis with spikelets placed as in Figure 27, but reduced to the second glume and a single floret. This little spikelet is sunken in the hollow of the rachis joint, the second glume fitting snugly over the hollow, the whole forming a long, slender, wiry cylinder. At maturity, the rachis disarticulates with the spikelet firmly embedded in the joints. See diagram of rachis Figure 28b, and above, a joint with spikelet removed, showing the hollow, and a second with the spikelet in position. The plant bearing these spikes grows along mudflats near the sea. The rachis joints are cylindrical and readily roll down the slope to the water. Being corky, they are carried by the lightest ripples and are thus spread over wide areas. The grain germinates within its little cell, and the young roots and leaves push aside the water-soaked glume. Returning to Figure 25 with one spikelet at each joint, flat against the rachis, compare with it Figure 29, Elymus virginicus, or ryegrass. In this, there are two spikelets at each joint of the rachis, the first glumes back to back, the spikelets somewhat distorted, each part reaching around the edges of the rachis. The figure shows a pair of spikelets and two joints of the rachis with the pair of spikelets next above, on the opposite side of the rachis, lightly sketched in behind. Two more internodes of the rachis with spikelets removed are shown by dotted lines. A diagrammatic sketch of a pair of spikelets, the distortion reduced, is shown above. A comparison of the diagrammatic spikelets with the spikelet in Figure 25 will show the structural similarity. In their natural position, the spikelets overlapping on the short joints and extending around the edges of the rachis so that at least one is seen nearly edgewise, form a spike that may well be confusing to the beginner, especially when, as in the species shown in Figure 29, and several others, the glumes stand out like a four-rayed involucre below the oppressed florets. However, a single joint with its spikelets attached, cut out of the spike, readily discloses the structure. In some species of Elymus, there are 3 spikelets and occasionally 4 or 5 at a node, the distortion being correspondingly greater. In several species, the glumes are so narrow as to appear like bristles or awns only. In most of the species, the rachis is continuous and cannot be disjointed. In a closely related genus, Sitanian, the rachis disarticulates at the base of each joint, the slender rigid joint remaining as a tiny, sharp-pointed stem below the cluster of long awned spikelets. The awn-like glumes of Sitanian commonly split between the nerves, sometimes to the very base, appearing like a cluster of awns below the florets. In a lemmas and Sitanian, the spikelets are all alike, or some occasionally variously aborted, and all sessile, not directly on the rachis. In Figure 30, Hordeum nodosum, one of the wild barleys, a group of 3 spikelets and a joint of the rachis are shown. As in Sitanian, the rachis disarticulates at the base of the internode, the joint remaining attached to the spikelets above it. Note that the central spikelet is sessile and the lateral ones pedicled, that the lower floret of the central spikelet is well developed while those of the lateral florets are rudimentary, and that the back of the floret is turned from the rachis with the glumes, bristle-like in this species, at the sides or back, contrary to the arrangement characteristic of grass spikelets. The problem of the glumes in Hordeum has not been satisfactorily solved. It appears probable that the reduced rachilla joint between the second glume and the floret is twisted and bent inwards, bringing the glumes at the side or the back of the floret. In the cultivated barley, rachis does not break up, as in the wild species, the continuous rachis having been fixed by selection. The florets fall from the spike in thrashing, or in naked or hull-less barley the grains fall from the lemma and palea, as in wheat. In cultivated 2-rowed barley, the lateral spikelets are pedicled and sterile, as in the wild species, but in 4-rowed and 6-rowed barley the lateral spikelets are sessile and fertile, characters fixed by selection. The grass is characterized by the spikate inflorescence dealt with in this lesson from the barley tribe, which, from the standpoint of man, is the most important group of grasses, if not all plants, in the world containing wheat, barley, and rye. Summary. The specialization in spikate inflorescence is chiefly in the rachis and next in the position of the relatively simple spikelets. When the glumes are distorted, standing side by side, as often found in species of Elymus, or when one of them is suppressed, we can tell which is which from the fact that the first or lowermost floret is always above or on the same side of the spikelet as the first glume. Review. Collect heads of wheat, rye, barley, or quack grass, species of Elymus, lolium, or squirrel-tail grass. One or more of those will be found anywhere in the United States. Note whether the rachis is readily disjoint. If so, separate out a single joint with the spikelets attached. Note where the rachis breaks at the summit or base of the joint. Note the number of spikelets at a joint and the number of florets to a spikelet. Distinguish the individual spikelets and their parts. If the rachis does not disjoint, cut across the middle of the internodes, taking out a single joint with attached spikelets. Note the number of spikelets into a joint. Whether there are 1 or 2 to several fertile florets to the spikelet, and whether the spikelet is placed flatwise or edgewise to the rachis. Note how the spikes bearing spikelets with scabrous awns push themselves forward when handled. Lesson 6. Pedicled spikelets with large glumes and other modifications. Turning again to the spikelet of Bromus secalinus, Figure 11, compare it with Figure 31, wild oats, Avena fatua. The glumes are greatly enlarged, and the rachilla joints are so short that the florets appear to be almost opposite. The awn, instead of extending from the apex of the lemma, protrudes from the back and is twisted for about half its length. We noted in Lesson 4 that the awn is an extension of the mid-nerve. This fact is well shown in the floret of wild oats, Figure 31b, the floret seen from the back, in which the mid-nerve leaves the body of the lemma about the middle of its back and becomes a free awn, while the lemma above the departure of the awn is nerveless. This is apparently the case when the awn is dorsal, that is, protruding from the back. The lemma is always nerveless above it. Compare Figures 31 and Figure 32, Tricetum spicatum. It will be seen that they are the same type of spikelet. In Tricetum, the awn is loosely twisted and is borne nearer the apex of the lemma, which is tipped with 2 slender teeth. In Danthonia spicata, Figure 33, the florets are more numerous and smaller in proportion to the glumes. The broad, strongly twisted awn arises from between the teeth or lobes of a bidentate, 2-toothed apex. See floret above, seen from the back. In these 3 spikelets, as in all but a few of the grasses of the oat tribe, the florets fall from the glumes which remain on the pedicle. In velvet grass, Nothulcus lanatus, figure 34, the spikelet falls entire. The articulation of the spikelet, taken throughout the grass family, is so nearly uniform for related genera that it is relied on to differentiate large series. See Lesson 2 on inflorescence. There are exceptions to the mode of articulation characteristic of the group as a whole, in the case of a few genera in 3 of our tribes. Such exceptions are puzzling to the beginner, leading him astray using keys. We must learn to observe all the characters of the inflorescence and base our judgment on the sum total of the characters, remembering that nature does as she pleases, and rejoicing that in grasses she at least pleases to keep invariably to the 2 ranked arrangements of the spikelets. See the summary of Lesson 2. In Lesson 4, figures 18 and 19, we observed spikelets in which the florets were of 2 kinds. In Nothulcus lanatus, the lower floret is perfect and awnless, and the upper is staminate and bears a hook-like awn from the back. Figure 34b, florets removed from the glumes. Note the curved and exceptionally long lowermost rachilla joint. In Sphenopholus, closely related to Trisatum, figure 32, the spikelets fall entire as in velvet grass. In tall oat grass, Arenatherum elatius, the spikelets bear 1 perfect awnless floret and 1 staminate awned floret as in velvet grass, but their position is reversed, the staminate being below and the perfect above. Summary. In the oat and its relatives, the large glumes and the awn of the lemmas are the most prominent characters, although in species of some genera the awn is wanting. Pubescence is commonly conspicuous. The inflorescence is an open or contracted panicle. Review. Collect panicles of wild oats or awned specimens of cultivated oats. Cultivated oats growing wild commonly bear awns. Of Danthonia, 1 or more species of which are to be found throughout most of the United States, and any of the related grasses available, and examine the spikelets. Place a floret with a twisted awn in a drop of water and observe the result. In awnless florets of cultivated oats, note that the midnerve of the lemma, if it is not at all produced into an awn, stops abruptly at the point where the awn would arise normally, and that the lemma is nerveless above this point, just as if it were awned. Lesson 7. Pedicled, 1-flowered spikelets. Turn to the spikelet of wild oats, figure 31, and in imagination eliminate all but the lowest floret and glumes. Better still, with a spikelet of oats in hand, break off all above the lowest floret. Now, we have a large model or pattern of the reduced spikelet of a very large number of grasses, redtop, timothy, and their kind. Examine Calamagrostis canadensis, figure 35, the floret raised from its glumes, and note how it corresponds to the pattern obtained by reducing the spikelet of oats to a single floret. The only vestige remaining of the other florets is the minute rachilla joint, back of the palea, shown exaggerated somewhat in figure 35. In all but a few genera, the rachilla is entirely suppressed. Compare figure 35 with figure 32, and note that Trisatum reduced to a single floret would closely resemble Calamagrostis. In Agrostis, figure 36, the rachilla is normally suppressed. In 2 species in the far west, it is present in a minute rudiment. In most of the species, the palea is also suppressed or represented by a rudiment only. Figure 36, Agrostis hyemalis, the floret with palea wanting raised from the glumes. Here we have specialization through elimination, the spikelet reduced almost to its lowest terms, 1 floret with no palea, no awn, no callus hairs. In this particular species, the very open panicles break off and roll before the wind as tumbleweeds, scattering the seed. Several species of Agrostis have awned lemmas, and some have callus hairs shorter and less copious than Calamagrostis. In Sporobolus, figure 37, the floret raised from the glumes and containing a mature grain, the nerves of the palea are wide apart, and the internerve, the space between the nerves, is thin in texture and readily splits as the grain matures. In some species it splits to the apex, resulting in an object sorely puzzling to the beginner, the two halves appearing like two one-nerved lemmas or paleas. In addition to the lemma itself, it is in such cases as this that a knowledge of the structure of the grass spikelet is necessary for the correct interpretation of the organs observed. In this genus, and in a few others, the pericarp, meaning around the fruit, the wall of the ripened ovary which forms a covering for the grain, and is usually grown fast to it, is free from the grain. In most of the species, it is a loose, thin sac which readily tears when moistened, leaving the grain naked. In one of our species, Spirobolus heterolepsis, the pericarp is firm, like a thin shell about the grain. In Cinna, the two nerves of the palea are so close together that they appear to be a single nerve. In one of the species, this nerve may be easily split into two, demonstrating the derivation of the apparent single nerve. In several genera, the glumes are enlarged. In Timothy, figure 38, they are firm in texture, strongly keeled, and abruptly awned, while the lemma is much smaller, thin in texture, and awnless. The spikelets are so congested on the short branches of the cylindrical spike-like panicle that the beginner may be puzzled to know just what is the unit of inflorescence. Keeping in mind that a spikelet never is compound, the student will divide and redivide the cluster until he finds an object having a single pair of glumes containing the floret. Another modification of glumes is shown in Alopecorus, figure 39. The margins are grown together for half of their length. As in Notholcus lanatus, figure 34, the articulation is an exception to that generally characteristic of its allied genera, the spikelets falling entire. The lemma bears a delicate dorsal awn and the palea is suppressed. In most species of Alopecorus, the panicle is as dense and spike-like as that of Timothy. In some genera, the glumes are reduced, see figure 42, and in a few species, the first glume is suppressed. In Lesson 4, figure 21, we noted perfect and sterile spikelets in the same panicle, and in figure 22 we found the spikelets falling in clusters of 3 sterile and 1 perfect spikelet. In Lycoris, figure 40, the spikelets are in pairs on the ultimate branchlets of the spike-like panicle, the lower spike-like sterile, the upper perfect. The ultimate branchlet itself falls with the spikelets attached, as in Acheirodes, figure 22. Lycoris shows another peculiar character in the 2-nerved first glume, one lateral nerve being undeveloped or very faint. The midnerve is extended into a long awn, and the lateral nerve is usually extended into a shorter awn, but is sometimes a mere tooth. The glumes and lemma in the spikelets so far examined in this lesson have been of like texture, membranaceous, like a membrane or skin. In Muhlenbergia, figures 41 and 42, the lemma is firmer in texture than the glumes. In some species of the genus, the glumes are much reduced, and in some, they are well developed and often awned. The lemmas are prominently 3-nerved and are awned or mucronate, that is, the midnerve extending in a minute point. In 4 of our genera, the lemma at maturity is firm and hard in texture, and the nerves are scarcely visible. In Milium, figure 43, the lemma is rigid, smooth, and shining, and the palea is of like texture. In Oryzopsis, figure 44, the lemma bears an awn that is readily disarticulating at its base. The palea is nearly enclosed by the lemma. In Stipa, figure 45, and Aristida, figure 46, the palea is entirely enclosed in the lemma. The callus, see page 22, is developed into a needle-like point that readily penetrates clothing or works its way into the wool of a sheep. In Stipa, the awn is composed of all the nerves of the lemma, forming a solid, slightly flattened, elongate body, the point of departure from the body of the lemma being marked by an abrupt contraction or a ring of hairs. In some species, the lower part of the awn is plumose, covered with soft, fluffy hairs like a feather. In Aristida, the awn is divided into 3, that is, the 3 nerves at first unite, then separate. The lemma tapers into the awn with no visible junction as in Stipa. Sometimes the undivided part of the awn is elongate, forming a slender neck, and sometimes the neck is twisted. In Aristida dichotoma, the species shown in figure 46, the lateral awns are much shorter than the central one. In many species, the 3 are subequal, and one or all may be recurved or loosely twisted at the base. They are never tightly twisted as in Stipa. Summary. The specialization in this group of grasses consists in the reduction of the relatively simplified spikelet to a single floret. In most of the genera, the spikelets are very small. The glumes may be reduced to rudiments or suppressed, or may be well developed and somewhat elaborated. The lemma may be delicate or indurate, hardened, and may be awned from the back or the summit. The palea shows more modification in this group than in any other. It may be suppressed or may be as long as the lemma. The two nerves may be coherent, appearing as one, or widely separated with the delicate internerve splitting. The rachilla may be extended beyond the base of the palea, a vestige of the suppressed florets, or it may be produced in a sharp callus below the lemma. The inflorescence is always a panicle, but this may be diffuse or dense, and cylindrical or capitate, like a head. Review. Collect panicles of redtop, timothy, or any grass with laterally compressed one-flowered spikelets. If the inflorescence is dense, distinguish the individual spikelets. Dissect the spikelets and note whether any of the organs are suppressed. Note the point of attachment of the awn, if any. If possible, collect panicles of any species of stipa. Lay a few of the florets in a little water and note the result. Note that twisted awns or the twisted parts of an awn are flattened. Lesson 8. Sessile spikelets in one-sided spikes. As stated in Lesson 5, development does not follow a single line. So, having come to the end of one line, we must repeatedly return to the center and start in a new direction. In the group of grasses taken up in this lesson, the principal character common to all is the spicate inflorescence. In the grasses related to barley, Lesson 5, we found solitary two-sided spikes, the spikelet sessile on the opposite sides of the rachis. In the present group, we have one-sided, unilateral spikes, the spikelet sessile, or nearly so, along one side of the rachis. The spikelets themselves range from the simple one of yard grass, Eleusine indica, figure 47, to highly specialized ones. Compare figure 47a with figures 11 and 14. It will be seen that although the glumes and lemmas of Eleusine are strongly keeled, the spikelets are of the same type. But these spikelets are very differently arranged, figure 47b, being crowded and imbricate, overlapping like shingles, in two rows on one side of the rachis. Two to several of these spikes are borne together, digitate, or nearly so. Digitate means arranged like fingers. But as a botanical term, it indicates the arrangement more like that of a bird's toes, the spikes borne on so short an axis that they appear to spring from the same point. In Lesson 7, we obtained the pattern of the one-flowered spikelet by eliminating all but the lowest floret and the glumes from a several-flowered spikelet. Eliminating all but the lowest floret of an Eleusine, we have the model of the spikelet of Bermuda grass, Capriola dactylon, figure 48a. A vestige of the eliminated florets remains in the prolonged rachilla, often with a rudimentary floret at its apex. The arrangement of the inflorescence, figure 48b, 3 of the spikes indicated in skeleton only, is the same as in Eleusine. Compare figures 48 and 49. Chloris latisquamea. In the latter, the upper florets, instead of being suppressed, are developed into one or a few sterile florets, consisting of modified lemmas without paleas. Turn to Lesson 3, in which sterile florets are discussed, page 23. In Melica, figure 19, we had an example of such sterile florets, and in Chloris we have another. In each case, the sterile lemmas, if spread out, show their derivation from the ordinary fertile lemmas. In Gramma grass, Butaloa, figures 50 and 51, is found the greatest specialization of the sterile floret. It is often more prominent than the fertile floret and so modified that its derivation is not always obvious. The pattern of its lemma, however, is like that of the fertile one, 3-nerved, the nerves extending into awns, figures 51c and figure 50c. The internerves are commonly broadened and reduced, as in figure 51c, or even suppressed. There is usually a single such floret, but in some species there are 2 or even 3. A second, sterile lemma, when present, may have a single awn, or be awnless, or even nerveless, figure 51d. In a few species, the sterile floret sometimes encloses a palea and stamens. Note that in Bouteloua, the spikes are not digitate, as in the foregoing genera, but are racemose, figures 50D and 51E. That is, the axis between the spikes is elongate instead of greatly reduced. In figure 10B is shown a raceme of spikelets. In Bouteloua, we have a raceme of spikes, each composed of few to many sessile spikelets. In Bouteloua gracilis, figure 51, and related species, the florets, as is usual in this group, fall from the glumes, these remaining on the rachis. In B. curtipendula, figure 50, and its relatives, the entire spike falls from the main axis. In an allied genus, Cathesticum, which looks like a diminutive Bouteloua, with but one species in the United States, the spikes consist of 3 spikelets crowded on the short rachis, the uppermost fertile, the 2 lower staminate or neuter. The spikes fall as a whole from the axis. In Lesson 3, page 24, it is stated that the position of sterile florets in the spikelets is the same in large series of related grasses. In the spikelets so far studied in this lesson, the sterile florets are above the perfect one. There is a single exception to this rule. In Campulosus, in which the 2 lower lemma are well developed but empty, the third fertile, and the upper 1 to 3 empty, like the lower. In 2 genera in this group, Spartina and Beckmannia, the spikelets fall entire. See Lesson 6, page 44, on exceptions. In Spartina, the spikelets are strictly one-flowered. In Beckmannia, they are usually one-flowered, but sometimes a second floret is developed. Throughout, we have seen widely different forms, such as Eleusine and Bouteloua, connected by intermediate forms like Capriola and Chloris. Such an intermediate between pedicled spikelets, as in Bromus, Poa, and others of Lessons 4, and sessile spikelets, as in the group we are now studying, is found in Leptocloa, in which the spikelets are arranged along one side of the slender rachises, but are borne on very short pedicles. The spikelets of our other genera in this highly specialized group present no special difficulty except for those of buffalo grass to be studied later. Summary. In this group, the spikelets are sessile and one-sided spikes, solitary, digitate, or racemose. In most of the genera, the upper florets are sterile, their lemmas greatly modified, or they are wholly suppressed. Review. Collect the inflorescence of Bermuda grass, yard grass, any of the grama grasses, or any available grass with one-sided spikes. Note the arrangement of the spikes on the main axis, distinguish the individual spikelets, and identify their parts. Lesson 9. Diversely Specialized Spikelets. In Lesson 4, Figure 22, page 31, we had an example of fertile and sterile spikelets in the same fascicle, the fascicle falling as a whole. Because the type of spikelet showed kinship with grasses having many flowered, laterally compressed spikelets, Acharodes is placed with them, although in its fascicles, falling as a whole, it forms an exception. In the grasses we are about to study in the present lesson, clustered spikelets are the characteristic specialization. Examine Figure 52, Agopogon, in which A represents a fascicle, spread apart, of 1 fertile and 2 sterile spikelets attached to the branch which falls with them. These little fascicles are racemose and nodding on the main axis. In Hilaria, Figure 53, the plan is the same, but the fascicles are sessile on the axis and erect. The spikelets are sessile in the fascicle, the glumes are elaborated and very unsymmetrical, and the sterile spikelets have 2 florets. The species figured is the commonest one. The fascicles of some of the other species are even more fantastic than these. The glumes and lemma are always sharply folded and compressed laterally. In one species, the glumes of the sterile spikelets are broad and fan-shaped. In another, they are curiously lobed and awned. In all species, they are exceedingly variable, but in each they follow a general pattern. The glumes of the fertile floret are often slightly adnate to, or grown to, those of the sterile spikelets, making the fascicle somewhat difficult to dissect. It is in such cases as this that the fundamental concept of the structure of a grass spikelet enables one to recognize the spikelet and its parts. So much elaboration for the production of a single grain is very exceptional in grasses, which as a whole tend to elimination of the non-essentials. A third grass having spikelets in little fascicles is Natsea. See figure 54. This is probably not closely related to Agopogon and Hilaria, but is commonly grouped with them because of its fascicles falling entire. This little burr-like fascicle is composed of two spikelets, both usually perfect, sometimes with a third reduced one. The minute first glumes are back-to-back, and the large second glumes covered with stout, hook-like hairs face outward. Note that the glumes are not folded as in Agopogon and Hilaria, but convex. These spikelets afford an excellent example of spine-like hairs. Hairs are an outgrowth of the epidermis, skin, and have no connection with the fibrous structure of the plant. The thorns of the rose furnish a well-known example. However stout they may be readily broken from the bark without tearing the wood. The thorns of hawthorns, plums, and locusts, on the contrary, however slender, cannot be broken off, being reduced branches. The woody fiber vascular bundles extends into them from the skeleton of the plant. In all spikelets figured heretofore, the sterile florets, when present, were above the perfect floret. In a group of grasses represented by only 3 genera in the United States, the spikelets bear a pair of sterile florets below the single perfect floret, and these fall attached to the fertile one. In sweet vernal grass, or anthoxanthum, figure 55, the sterile florets consist of empty lemmas unequally awned from the back and divided above the insertion of the awn. The fertile floret is much smaller, awnless, smooth, and shining. A beginner, in dissecting this spikelet, might mistake this fertile floret for the grain, and so take the sterile florets for a lemma and a very peculiar palea. Whenever a spikelet or any of its parts seems to present a marked departure from the normal type, such as a one-awned palea would be, it is advisable to re-examine and reconsider. A close examination of this fertile floret will reveal the thin edges of the lemma enfolding the palea. A grain may always be recognized by the embryo at the base of the back. See figure 5a. In Toracea, called holy grass, vanilla grass, or Seneca grass, the sterile florets are awnless and contain paleas and stamens. Like anthoxanthum, the whole plant is fragrant. These are the grasses of which sweetgrass baskets are made. In Phalaris, the glumes are enlarged and strongly keeled, or, as in canary grass, P. canariensis, figure 56, the wing-keeled and the sterile florets are reduced to small empty lemmas. In one species, P. minor, the first sterile floret is reduced to a minute rudiment, and in the common reed canary grass, P. arundinacea, both sterile lemmas are narrow and hairy. In Lesson 7, figure 42, page 50, we had an example of greatly reduced glumes. In rice, Oryza sativa, figure 57, the glumes are minute, and the lemma and palea are indurate, hardened, and compressed laterally. Some varieties of rice have an awned lemma. In an allied genus, Homolocenchrus, figure 58, the glumes are wholly suppressed. In Lesson 4, figures 23, page 32, and 24, page 32, we had unisexual spikelets, the staminate and pistelet, on distinct plants. Wild rice, Zizania palustris, figure 59a and b, is monoecious staminate and pistelet spikelets borne in the same panicle, the awnless staminate ones pendulous on the spreading lower branches, the awned pistelet ones erect on the ascending upper branches. In the pistelet spikelets, the suppressed glumes are represented by a very shallow ridge around the base of the spikelet. The staminate flower consists of 6 stamens instead of 3, as in the grasses studied heretofore. The palea of this spikelet is anomalous in that it has 3 nerves. Throughout the grasses, the palea has 2 nerves, rarely suppressed, as in agrostis, where the palea itself is much reduced, or close together as to be merged into one, but in no case are more than 2 nerves known. The problem presented by this spikelet has not been satisfactorily solved. It is possible that 2 organs are, respectively, the second glume and the lemma, the first glume and the palea being suppressed. In the pistelet spikelet, the palea is 2-nerved. In the perennial wild rice of the southeastern states, Zizania miliacea, this 3-nerved organ is present in both the staminate and pistelet spikelets, and in another related genus, Luseola, both bracts of the spikelets are several to many-nerved. Summary. In the highly specialized spikelets studied in this lesson, the various organs are identified 1. By their position, bearing in mind that the bracts of a spikelet are two-ranked and alternate on the rachilla, and 2. By their resemblance to corresponding organs in allied grasses. Review. Hilaria, Notzia, and Agopogon are found only in the southwest, but other grasses studied in this lesson are widespread. In any region of the United States will be found one or more of them. Collect any that are available, examine the inflorescence, distinguish the spikelets, and identify their parts. If in a species of florets, but one sterile floret is found below the perfect one, how can you tell which pair is suppressed? Lesson 10. Spikelets with membranaceous glumes and hardened fruits. All the spikelets heretofore studied have been more or less compressed laterally. That is, a detached spikelet under observation lies on its side, and the two ranks of glumes and lemmas to right and left of the rachilla, as in figures 11 to 14, and with relatively few exceptions, the articulation has been above the glumes, those remaining on the pedicle after the fall of the florets. These two characters in common pertain to more than half of all our grasses. In many of the laterally compressed spikelets, the florets themselves are dorsally compressed. See figure 11b. We come now to a lesser group in which the spikelets are dorsally compressed, the spikelet under observation lying on its face or back, the two ranks above or below the rachilla. In this group of grasses, the rachilla joints are usually so short that the glumes and lemmas are borne one immediately above the other. The rachilla is never prolonged beyond the base of the fertile floret, as in many of the spikelets heretofore studied. Examine figure 60. Note that the first glume is much smaller than the second. Turn to figure 11, page 25. In imagination, remove the glumes and all but the lower florets. The result is comparable to the two florets, figure 60c, of panicum, but in this genus the lower floret is staminate or sterile, and its lemma and palea differ in form and texture from those of the perfect floret, figure 60d. The sterile lemma, commonly termed the third glume in all but recent books, resembles the second glume and encloses a small thin palea, while the fertile lemma is indurate, its nerves obscured by the thickened tissue, and firmly clasps a palea of like texture. At maturity, the grain is enclosed in this fast-locked little case, the whole commonly termed the fruit, and germinates within it, sending its rootlet through a thin place near the base of the lemma, seen as a crescent-shaped depression in the back, and thrusting its sprout between the lemma and palea at the summit or side. In dissecting a spikelet of panicum or its related genera, the palea of the sterile floret often adheres to the palea side of the fruit, the mature fertile floret, as in a small thin scale difficult for the beginner to account for unless he understands the structure of the spikelet. This type of spikelet is characteristic of the large number of grasses forming the millet tribe. In panicum, the inflorescence is an open or contracted panicle. In crabgrass, Syntherisma sanguinalis, figure 61, and its relatives, the spikelets are borne in one-sided racemes, much like that of Bermuda grass, figure 48. In the crabgrasses, the first glume is minute or suppressed, and the second is commonly much shorter than the sterile lemma and the fertile floret. The fertile lemma and its palea are less indurate than those of panicum, and the margin of the lemma is thin in texture and flat instead of being firm and inrolled as in panicum. In paspalum, figure 62, the spikelets are more like those of panicum in texture, and the margin of the fertile lemma is firm and inrolled, as in that genus. The first glume is wholly suppressed except in a few species. The spikelets are subsessile in two rows on one side of the rachis, either single, figures 62 and 63a, or in pairs, figure 63b. In descriptions, these are often referred to as two-rowed or four-rowed respectively. In species with paired spikelets, some of the secondary ones, those next to the center of the rachis, are always abortive. The racemes in paspalum are sometimes solitary and sometimes digitate, as in Syntherisma, but more commonly they are racemose on the main axis, as in figure 62. The rachis is sometimes winged and in a few species the broad wings fold up over the base of the spikelets. In Rhymarochlua, represented by but one species in the United States, the spikelets are arranged as in Paspalum, but both glumes are suppressed except in the uppermost spikelet. Recall Lolium, Lesson 5, Figure 27, page 36. If it were not for its obvious relationship to Paspalum, in which an occasional first glume is developed in several species and regularly in a few, the spikelet of Rhymarochlua might be taken to be strictly one-flowered, with only the first glume suppressed except in the terminal spikelet. In Paspalum we have seen a slightly broadened rachis, Figure 63. In Stenotaphrem, or St. Augustine grass, Figure 64, the rachis is broad, thick, and corky, and the spikelets are partly embedded in it. At maturity, the rachis breaks up into short joints with the spikelets attached. Recall Leptorus, Lesson 5, Figure 28, page 37. In Syntherisma, Paspalum, Rhymarochlua, and Stenotaphrem, with subsessile spikelets borne on one side of a rachis, the spikelets are placed with the back of the fertile lemma against the rachis, that is, with the first glume, developed or hypothetical, sterile lemma, and the palea of the fertile floret outward. In Axanopus, Figure 65, Brachiaria, and Areocloa, these spikelets are reversed, and the back of the fertile lemma being turned from the rachis and the palea toward it. In Axanopus, the first glume is wholly suppressed. In Areocloa, Figure 66, the first glume is reduced to a minute sheath around the enlarged rachilla joint below the second glume and grown fast to it. The fertile lemma is tipped with a minute awn, which breaks off readily. In barnyard grass, Echinocloa cruscali is the same type of spikelet as in panicum, but the second glume and sterile lemma are awned or awn-tipped, and the pointed tip of the palea is not enclosed in the lemma, which is also sharp-pointed. The glumes and sterile lemma bear spine-like hairs, but not so thick as those of Knotsia. Observe the diagrammatic panicle in Figure 67a. In imagination, remove all the terminal spikelets from a branch. The result is Figure 67. Compare Figure 68 with this. It will be seen that the bristles of the latter are branches of the panicle which are without spikelets at their tips, but which bear subsessile spikelets at or toward their base. This modification of sterile branches and branchlets into rough bristles is found in the millets, Chaetocloa, common millet, yellow foxtail, and green foxtail. These branchlets are the involucre of bristles, referred to in many manuals and descriptions. The spikelets fall from their pedicles, as in panicum, and the bristles remain on the axis. In most of the species, the panicles are dense and spike-like, and the spikelet-bearing branches fascicled and very short, and the sterile ones, or bristles, long and slender. In yellow foxtail, Chaetocloa lutescens, Figure 69, the fascicle consists of several branches, only one of them spikelet-bearing, the others transformed into slender bristles. Between the ordinary panicle represented in Figure 67 and the bristly, spike-like one of yellow foxtail, Figure 69b, there is every degree of gradation. A further specialization of sterile branches is shown in the sandburs, Cenchrus. Compare Figure 70 with Figure 69a. Instead of the nearly simple fascicle of branchlets found in the millets, the sandburs have a complex fascicle of many compound branches. The primary branches disarticulate from the axis, and the whole fascicle, or burr, falls entire with the spikelet permanently enclosed, the grain eventually germinating within it. The simplest form of sandbur is Cenchrus myosauroides, Figure 70. The structure of this will be comprehended if we conceive of a dense fascicle of branches, with but one of them bearing a single sessile spikelet, the others branching at the base and surrounding the spikelet bearing one. In the common inland sandbur, Cenchrus passiflorus, Figure 71, the sterile branches are much thickened and flattened, and are grown together below, their free summit sharp and spine-like. The numerous secondary branches, in the form of stout spines, spread from the body of the burr formed by the cohesion of the main branches surrounding the one or few sessile spikelets. In all, the seed-bearing spikelets so far examined, The stamens and stigmas project at flowering time, resulting in cross-fertilization of the ovules. A few grasses bear cleistogamous, close fertilized, as well as openly fertilized spikelets. Such spikelets do not open, and there is usually but a single small stamen which empties its pollen directly on the short stigmas. The grain is larger than that of the open fertilized spikelets. Two of our native grasses forming the genus Amphicarpon, related to panicum, are remarkable in that they produce large cleistogamous spikelets underground from subterranean branches, figure 72. The plants also bear terminal panicles of ordinary and much smaller spikelets, but these seldom perfect seed. Summary. In Panaceae, the millet tribe, the spikelets fall entire. They bear one perfect floret with the sterile floret below it. The lemma and palea of the perfect floret are indurate. The sterile lemma resembles the second glume, the two simulating a pair of glumes, while the first glume is small and looks like an additional one. In some older works it is called the accessory valve or glume, or is entirely suppressed. The genera differ chiefly in the arrangement of the spikelets in the inflorescence. In a few genera, some of the panicle branches are without spikelets and are transformed into bristles or burrs. Review. Collect the inflorescence of broom-corn millet, old witchgrass, or of as many species of panicum as are available, and dissect the spikelets. Collect heads of barnyard grass and compare the spikelets with those of panicum. Compare the spine-like hairs with those of Notsia, figure 54. Collect the inflorescence of crabgrass and any species of paspalum available. Note the arrangement of spikelets and compare the form and texture of the fruit, fertile floret, with that of panicum. Collect heads of common millet or of yellow or green foxtail. Remove enough branches from the axis to show clearly the form and arrangement of the few remaining. If available, examine a sand burr, splitting the burr with a sharp knife. Lesson 11. Paired spikelets with hardened glumes and thin lemmas. In the sorghum tribe, which we are about to study, the spikelet, as in the millet tribe, falls entire and is dorsally compressed, but the glumes are hardened and the lemmas thin, while in the millet tribe the glumes are thin and the fertile lemma and palea are hardened. The glumes entirely enclosed the two florets. The midnerve of the first glume is commonly suppressed, while a pair of nerves near the margin is often prominent and sometimes keeled or even winged. The second glume may be like the first, or the midnerve may be slightly keeled. The lower floret consists of an empty lemma only, the upper of a perfect flower with a small, thin, often awned lemma, sometimes so small as to appear a bit like a bit of membrane at the base of the awn, and a minute palea, sometimes suppressed. Examine figure 73a and compare it with figures 21, page 30, 22, page 31, 30, page 40, 40, page 49, 52, page 61, and 53, page 62. In all the figures referred to, fertile spikelets are associated with sterile ones. These are grouped in various ways. In the sorghum tribe, the typical arrangement is a jointed raceme with sessile perfect spikelet and pedicled sterile spikelet, staminate or neuter. At each joint, the rachis disarticulating at the summit of each joint, this and the pedicle of the sterile spikelet remaining attached at their base to the perfect spikelet as a pair of little stalks. In this group of grasses, specialization consists chiefly in modifications of the axes of inflorescence and secondarily in the modification of the spikelets. In figure 73a, Johnson grass, Holcus halepensis, are two views of a single joint consisting of a sessile perfect spikelet with the attached rachis joint and the pedicel with its staminate spikelet. In figure 73b is a diagram of a raceme of four such joints, and 73c a diagram of the rachis and pedicles, the spikelets removed, and the points of disarticulation shown by dotted lines. In sorghum, or Holcus, these little racemes are borne on the ultimate branchlets of a pedicle, figure 73d. In the closely related Indian grass, Sorghastrum, the racemes are reduced to one or two joints and the sterile spikelets are wholly suppressed, the slender, hairy pedicle alone being developed. Compare figure 74a, a diagrammatic single joint of Erianthus saccharoides with figure 73a and figure 74b, 3 joints of a long raceme with figure 73b. It will be seen that while the spikelets are paired, the pedicled spikelet is as large as the sessile one and, like it, is awned. In this genus, the pedicled spikelet is usually perfect. The racemes are long and slender and copiously hairy, and are crowded on a stout main axis, forming large, dense, woolly panicles. In sugarcane, the inflorescence is like that of Erianthus, but the spikelets are awnless. Examine figure 75a, a joint of a raceme of one of the broom sedges, Andropogon scoparius. It will be seen to have the same general plan as a joint of sorghum, and the racemes, shown in figure 75b, though slender and flexuous, are in structure similar to the racemes of sorghum. The entire inflorescence, however, is very different. In sorghum and Erianthus, the inflorescence is a leafless and terminal panicle, such as is common in grasses. The diagrammatic inflorescence, figure 75b, shows that the racemes of the broom sedge are borne on numerous slender leafy branches arising in the axils of leaves on the main culm of branches, the whole forming a compound inflorescence. The leaves, especially the ultimate ones immediately below the racemes, are mostly reduced to bladeless sheaths and are sometimes bright-colored. Such transformed leaves subtending or surrounding single inflorescences are commonly termed spathes. In some species, the racemes are partly enclosed in the spathes. The racemes may be solitary, that is, one to a branch as shown, or two to several digitate on a single branch. In some species, the sterile spikelet is suppressed, only the pedicle being developed. In a few species of Andropogon, the racemes are in leafless panicles, as in Erianthus, but the pedicled spikelets are sterile and awnless. Examine figure 76a, Membranaceous cylindrica, and compare it with 73a. In Holcus and Erianthus, the rachis joint and the pedicle of the second spikelet are about equal in thickness. In figure 75, the rachis joint is stouter than the pedicle. In Membranaceous, the rachis joint is greatly thickened and hollowed out below on the inner face. See figure 28, page 37 for an earlier example of a thickened rachis. The pedicle of the sterile spikelet is also thickened, but much less so, and the two lie close together instead of spread apart, as in figures 73 to 75, and entirely cover the second glume side of the spikelet, which fits into the cavity formed by the rachis joint and the pedicle. Figure 76c shows the interfaces of the rachis joint and pedicle, the perfect spikelet removed. The spikelets are awnless, and the marginal nerves of the first glume are winged at the summit. This inflorescence and that of Leptorus, figure 28, are so similar in appearance and function, disjointing with the mature seed permanently attached, that the student may wonder why they are placed in tribes so remote as the barley grasses and sorghum. The two illustrate what is not seldom shown in nature, that very different structures may arrive at the same function, although the forms from which they are derived were very remote. The inflorescence of Leptorus is a spike, and its spikelet shows it to be a reduced and specialized relative of Lolium. The inflorescence of Membranaceous is a raceme with two spikelets at a joint, one pedicled, and the perfect spikelet not greatly different from that of sorghum. We have just observed the rachis joint and pedicle lying closely pressed together. In Rhytulix, figure 77a, they are adnate, grown together. Examine the diagram of 3 joints with the spikelets removed, figure 77c, and note that the rachis joints, the thicker parts, form a central axis with the pedicles borne on alternate sides, just as they are in Holcus, figure 73c. In this raceme, we have just the reverse of the rearrangement of Membranaceous. In that, the fertile spikelet fits into a cavity formed by the rachis joint and pedicle, while in Rhytulix, the rachis joint and pedicle fit into a cavity formed by the fertile spikelet. See figure 77d showing the inside face of the first glume of the perfect spikelet, and examine the 2 views of the joints, A and B, and the 2 views of the raceme, E and F. The sterile spikelet is well developed, but usually contains no flower. The perfect spikelet with its peculiar gray, ridged, and pitted subglobose first glume suggests the achene of some species of scleria, a sedge. The whole inflorescence is very unlike that of any other known grass. Return to Figure 73 and compare with it Figure 78a, Rhapis passiflora, which shows a raceme reduced to a single joint consisting of the sessile perfect spikelet and the two pedicled sterile spikelets, the rachis joint found in Holcus and the others studied, often being replaced by a second pedicle and a sterile spikelet. This second sterile spikelet is not always developed. In Rhapis, this one-jointed raceme has a sharp, hairy callus at its base. Figure 78b, the base of a raceme and the summit of a branch, the hairs removed, shows the source of this callus. The racemes are borne on the long, slender branches of a spreading panicle, Figure 78d, which disarticulate obliquely below the raceme, the line of articulation bordered by a dense brush of hairs, Figure 78c. The sterile spikelets with their pedicles fall off before the maturity of this perfect spikelet, which, with its hairy callus and long awn, closely resembles a mature floret of stipa, Figure 45. In Heteropogon, Figure 79, is a more complicated arrangement. In A is shown a joint of the raceme, consisting of the sessile perfect awn spikelet and a pedicled large pale sterile spikelet with the short hairy rachis joined below forming a pointed callus. In Figure 79c is seen the base of the fertile spikelet and the callus with enough hairs removed to expose the very base of the pedicle, which has fallen with the sterile spikelet, and, to the left, the oblique scar from which the rachis joint next above has disarticulated. The articulation is at the base of the rachis joint instead of at the summit, as in Holcus and the others, Figures 73 through 77, and forms a callus to the spikelet next above. The rachis joints are very short, and the fertile spikelets, except their awns, are hidden by the overlapping sterile spikelets, the long flexuous awns forming a tangle beyond the end of the raceme, Figure 79d. Besides having this modified rachis and large unsymmetrical sterile spikelets, the raceme of Heteropogon presents a further modification in that its lower 2 or 3 pairs of spikelets are all sterile, instead of each pair consisting of a perfect and sterile one, as is typical for the sorghum tribe. In these lower pairs, the sessile spikelet is staminate and the pedicled one empty, but both have large unsymmetrical glumes and appear to be alike. Examine the diagram of the raceme, Figure 79e. The rachis greatly lengthened to show the structure and arrows indicating the points of disarticulation, and contrast it with Figure 73b. Figure 79f is a diagram of the rachis of 4 joints showing the points of disarticulation. Contrast it with Figure 73c. The mature fertile spikelets of Rhapis and Heteropogon closely resemble the mature fruits of stipa and function in the same way, disseminating the seed by attaching themselves by their sharp calluses to passing animals and securing their hold by the untwisting and twisting of their hygroscopic, moisture-sensitive awn. They afford another example of the same function performed by different organs. Summary. The grasses of the sorghum tribe have spikelets with hardened glumes and thin lemmas. Typically, they are arranged in pairs, one sessile and perfect, the other pedicled and sterile, on a jointed rachis forming racemes. In several genera, the rachis is elaborately modified. Review. Collect the inflorescence of Johnson grass and of any of the broom sedges. Break the raceme into single joints, noting the points at which it readily separates. Examine the spikelets and the rachis and distinguish the rachis joint from the pedicle. If you had a panicle of Rhapis, Figure 78d, from which all the sterile spikelets with their pedicles had fallen, how would you know it was not a species of stipa? Make diagrams of the inflorescence of any available species of the sorghum tribe. Lesson 12. Highly specialized unisexual spikelets. Examine Figure 80, gamma grass, Tripsicum dactyloides. This grass is monoecious, see page 23. The pistillate spikelets are borne on the lower part of the 1 to 3 stout digitate racemes and staminate spikelets on the upper part of the same racemes. Figure 80D. The part of the rachis bearing the staminate spikelets is relatively slender and falls off after flowering time. The part bearing the pistillate spikelets is greatly thickened and disarticulates with the spikelets permanently embedded in the joints. Figure 80A shows two joints with the spikelets embedded. B, a spikelet removed from the joint. C, the joint from which a spikelet has been removed. And E, a diagram of the rachis. Compare the joints with those of Manosurus, page 76. Note that in Tripsicum, the pistillate part is a simple spike with no vestige of a second spikelet. The structure of the spikelet is similar to that of spikelets of the sorghum tribe, having firm glumes. The first hard and like the rachis joint in texture. A thin sterile lemma and a very thin fertile lemma and palea. The staminate spikelets are in pairs, figure 80F, and one of each pair is usually on a very short pedicle. The glumes are much like those of different species of Andropogon, both florets and staminate, their lemmas and paleas thin. Indian corn, or maize, Zea maize, the most highly specialized grass known, is believed to be related to Tripsicum. It is monoecious, but the staminate and pistillate spikelets are borne in distinct inflorescences. The staminate spikelets are in pairs on a slender rachis forming racemes, these arranged in a panicle, the tassel, at the summit of the culm. The pistillate spikelets are in pairs, crowded in 8 to 16 rows, rarely more, always an even number, on a greatly thickened compound axis, the cob, borne in the axils of the leaves and enveloped in numerous leafy bracts, husks, the long styles, the silk, protruding from the summit, the whole called the ear. The staminate spikelets, figure 81C, are much like those of Tripsicum and contain two staminate florets. The pistillate spikelets stand at right angles to their axis, the cob, figure 81A. The glumes are minute, scarcely covering the ovary at flowering time, figure 81B, and in the ripened grain remain as chaff on the cob, the greatly enlarged grain being naked. This grain, a kernel of corn, remains on the axis until loosened by force. Indian corn is known only in cultivation. The problem of its origin has not yet been solved. We know only that it originated somewhere in America, probably in the uplands of the tropics. It was widely cultivated by the Aborigines when the western continents were discovered. The problem of the morphology of the ear of corn has not yet been satisfactorily solved, but it is not at all difficult to recognize the individual spikelets, both staminate and pistillate. The student who has come this far will find it possible to dissect the inflorescence of any of our grasses, with the possible exception of buffalo grass, and to distinguish the spikelets and the different organs. Buffalo grass, Bulbulus dactyloides, is placed in the same tribe as the grama grasses, page 57, but it has been left until the last so that the student might have the greater experience to draw on. It is dioecious, page 23, and the staminate and pistillate inflorescences are strikingly different. Recall figure 24, page 32. Examine figure 82b, showing a pistillate spikelet with a small, narrow first glume and a very large, broad, three-toothed second glume entirely enfolding the body of the floret. The floret removed from the glume is shown in figure 82c. Its three-toothed lemma approaches in form the lemma of some of the grama grasses. Compare with figure 50b. This pistillate spikelet as presented is not at all puzzling. The large, thick second glume with overlapping edges entirely enclosing the floret being the only remarkable feature. These spikelets, however, are borne in the curious inflorescence shown in figure 82a. These little hard white heads are borne, mostly two together, on a very short slender axis in the axils of a broadened sheath at the summit of short culms and very much overtopped by the blades. If we cut off the base of one of these little heads, we have 3 to 5 such spikelets as shown in figure 82b, which had been held rigidly together by the hard thickened base. The overlapping backs of the second glumes forming a thick white wall surmounted by their green toothed summits. The base can be nothing but a rachis, shortened, broadened, and thickened. though all trace is lost of the junction of the spikelets and the rachis. Figure 82D is a diagram of half a head showing one of the two rows of spikelets. Compare this with 51E, showing a great number of spikelets on elongate rachis. As in Bouteloua gracilis, the spikelets stand nearly at right angles to the rachis and the first glume is inward, that is, it would be against the rachis as in Bermuda grass if the spikelets were oppressed. The difficulty the student encounters in comprehending the pistillate inflorescence of buffalo grass is not so much due to the complexity as due to the difficulty of dissecting the rigid little structure, and also to the suppression or deformity of some of the organs. When spikelets are closely crowded, as in Cenchrus burr, in some of the species of millet, and in buffalo grass, some of them are nearly always deformed from pressure. In buffalo grass, one or two of the spikelets in a head are not fully developed. The first glume is commonly reduced to a minute scale in 2 or 3 of the spikelets, and sometimes it is suppressed. The staminate inflorescence, figure 82E, resembles the spikes of grama grass, figure 51E, but the spikelets, figure 82F, are awnless and the second floret is well developed and contains a staminate flower. Summary. In the case of greatly modified structures, the different organs are to be interpreted by their relative position and by their analogy to corresponding organs in related grasses. Review. Collect the inflorescences of Tripsicum if available, disjoint it, and dissect the spikelets. Examine a very young ear of corn, and note that the spikelets are always in pairs. Consequently, an ear of corn always has an even number of rows. Distinguish the glumes and the lemmas. Examine the staminate spikelets. If available, collect buffalo grass and dissect the staminate and pistillate inflorescence, preparing the latter by boiling it a few moments in water, to which a few drops of glycerin have been added. When no glume but the large thickened one is found in the pistillate spikelet of buffalo grass, how do you know which glume that is? Appendix. Diagrammatic summary of the primary characters of the tribes. Series 1. Poetiae. Spikelets laterally compressed, florets mostly falling from the persistent glumes. 1. Festucae. Fescue tribe. Spikelets many-flowered, glumes relatively small, lemmas awned from summit or awnless, inflorescence a panicle. Contains fescues, brome grasses, and bluegrass. 2. Hordeae. Barley tribe. Spikelets, 1 to many-flowered, sessile on opposite sides of a jointed rachis, forming a spike. Rachis rather than spikelet specialized. Inflorescence a solitary spike. Contains wheat, rye, and barley. 3. Avenae, oat tribe. Like Festucae, but glumes enlarged and florets fewer in number. Rachilla joints short, lemmas awned from the back, inflorescence a panicle, contains oats. 4. Agrostidae, Timothy tribe. Like Festucae, reduced to its lowest terms, spikelets one-flowered. Lemmas awnless or awned, the awn from back or summit. Glumes sometimes awned, sometimes suppressed. Inflorescence a panicle. Contains redtop and timothy. 5. Chloridae, Grama tribe. Spikelets 1 to several flowered, sessile on one side of a continuous rachis. All but the lowest florets commonly sterile and variously modified. Inflorescence of 2 to several one-sided spikes, solitary, racemose, or digitate. Contains grama grasses. 6. Nautiae, curly mesquite tribe. Spikelets 1 or 2 flowered, in fascicles, the whole falling not from a main axis entire. Not a natural tribe, some of the genera included not being closely related. 7. Phalaриdae, canary grass tribe. Spikelets with 1 perfect floret and 2 sterile florets below, these falling attached to the fertile floret. Inflorescence a panicle, contains canary grass and sweet vernal grass. 8. Oryzae, rice tribe. Spikelets, one-flowered, falling from the pedicle entire, glumes reduced or suppressed, inflorescence a panicle. Contains rice. 9. Zizaniae, Indian rice tribe. Plants, monoecious. Spikelets, one-flowered, falling entire. Glumes, suppressed. Inflorescence, a panicle, wild or Indian rice. Series 2. Panicatiae. Spikelets dorsally compressed, falling entire singly or together with parts of the axis. 10. Paniceae, millet tribe. Spikelets with one perfect terminal floret and a sterile floret below. Racilla joints very short. Glumes membranaceous. The first small, suppressed in some genera, sterile lemma like the second glume, the two appearing like a pair of glumes. Fertile lemma and palea indurate. Inflorescence a panicle, or of one of the many racemes, these digitate or racemose on the main axis. Contains millets and crabgrasses. 11. Andropogoniae, sorghum tribe. Spikelets paired, one perfect and sessile, the other sterile and pedicelate, borne on a jointed rachis. Fertile spikelets with one perfect terminal floret and a sterile lemma below, falling with joints of rachis and sterile pedicled spikelet attached. Glumes indurate, enclosing the florets, lemma very thin, palea often suppressed. Contains sugarcane, Johnson grass, and broom sedges. 12. Tripsaceae, corn tribe. Plants monoecious, pistillate spikelets with one perfect terminal floret and a sterile lemma below, falling embedded in the joints of the rachis, persistent on the thick compound axis in zea. Staminate spikelets, two-flowered in pairs, racemose. Contains gama grass and Indian corn. General information for the beginner. It is hoped that after completing the 12 lessons, the student will be eager to study and identify the grasses of his region. To aid the beginner in the study of the plant, the following outline is offered, suggesting points to be observed. Outline for study of a grass plant. Duration: annual, winter annual, summer annual. Perennial: without rhizomes, with or without winter rosette, with rhizomes, these short or long, thick, knotty, or slender. Habit: erect, ascending, prostrate, geniculate, creeping, rooting at nodes, or stoloniferous. Tufted culms, few or solitary. Culm: height, slender or robust, simple or branching, from upper nodes, lower nodes, or all nodes. Glabrous, scabrous, or pubescent, throughout or below nodes or inflorescence. Nodes: glabrous or pubescent, hairs suppressed, spreading retrorse, i.e. pointing backwards. Sheaths: close, loose, or spreading, glabrous or pubescent, note margin and summit, open, as common, or closed. Ligule: length, membranaceous, hairy, stiff or delicate, obsolete. Blades: erect or spreading, length and width, shape, rounded, clasping, or narrowed at the base, flat, folded, or involute, texture, thin, thick, rigid, or lax, surface, glabrous, pubescent, pilose, villous, or hispid, scabrous, note each surface and margin. Inflorescence: terminal only on main culm and branches, or axillary also, simple or compound, panicle, size, length, and width, loose or compact, few flowered or many flowered, nodding or erect, raceme, size, etc., spike, size, etc. Axis of panicle: size, pubescence, etc., branches, solitary, fascicled or whorled, flexuous or stiff, ascending, spreading, or reflexed. Axis of raceme or spike: continuous or disjointing, slender, stout, narrow, winged, pubescence. Spikelet: pedicled or sessile, laterally or dorsally compressed, falling entire, alone, or with joints of axis. Florets falling from the glumes, number of florets. Glumes: similar or unlike, size compared to spikelet, 1/2, 1/3, etc., shape, awned, toothed, etc., texture, nerving, pubescence. Lemma: fertile or sterile, size, shape, texture, pubescence. Palea, flower-bearing or empty, size, sometimes obsolete, shape, and texture. It will further the student's self-training if he writes down the characters of the first few grasses studied, and of any particularly puzzling or interesting later ones, making drawings of the spikelet and its parts, or diagrams of complicated inflorescences. One should not hesitate to make drawings merely because he cannot draw. However crude a sketch may be, it is of great value not only as a record of observations, but for its training in powers of observation. The one who never could draw is the very one who should make frequent drawings, however crude they may be. Anyone wishing to make a serious study of grasses should prepare an herbarium, that is, a collection of plants pressed and dried in such a way that they may be mounted by gummed straps to sheets of heavy paper and arranged in folders for reference. Grasses so prepared keep indefinitely. A circular giving directions for preparing herbarium specimens of grasses, Bureau of Plant Industry Document 442, 1909, may be obtained without charge on request to the Office of the Systematic Agrostologist, Bureau of Plant Industry, United States Department of Agriculture, Washington, D.C. In studying grasses, the first thing to understand the structure of the plant in hand, particularly its inflorescence. The second is to learn its relationship to other grasses and what name has been applied to it. The latter is what is meant by identifying or determining a plant. Practically all the grasses of the United States are described in one or more manuals of botany or state floras. Most of these manuals give keys to genera or species. The word key is used figuratively, an instrument by means by which a way is opened. A key is an arrangement of contrasting characters by which, choosing one and rejecting the other, the student is led to the name which applies to the plant in his hand. For example, take figures 23, 27, 45, 48, 65, and 76, and trace them through the following key, reading both the lines having like indentation, these giving the contrasting characters from which to choose. Spikelets laterally compressed, the florets falling from the persistent glumes. Inflorescence, a panicle, spikelets pedicled. Plants dioecious, spikelets several flowered. Disticless. Plants perfect, spikelets one-flowered. Stipa. Inflorescence a spike, spikelets sessile. Spike solitary, spikelets several flowered, borne on opposite sides of the rachis. Oleum. Spikes several digitate, spikelets one-flowered, borne on one side of the rachis. Capriola. Spikelets dorsally compressed, the spikelets falling entire or together with joints of the rachis. Spikelets dorsally compressed, the spikelets falling entire or together with joints of the rachis. Spikelets all alike, solitary, borne singly on a continuous rachis. Axinopus. Spikelets of two kinds, borne in pairs, one sessile and perfect, the other pedicled and sterile, the rachis articulated. Anthropogon. In actual work, of course, one never has so simple a problem as that. With exceptions, such are noted on pages 44 and 59, and closely related genera and species, it often demands careful weighing of all facts to use an extended key successfully, but it is excellent training in judgment. The name reached in the key is verified or rejected by reading the description in the text and noting how the characters of the plants agree with those specified. When the description does not apply to the plant in hand, one must return to the key and try again. Books. The plants one obtains for himself, and he studies them by means of the few tools mentioned before, page 6. To identify the plant requires books. A recently published work, The Genera of Grasses in the United States by A.S. Hitchcock, Bulletin 772, United States Department of Agriculture, giving keys to tribes and genera, descriptions and illustrations of all the genera, and notes on the more important species, as well as indications of exceptions, most helpful to a beginner, is the first book which the student should acquire. It may be obtained from the Superintendent of Documents, Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C. at 40 cents a copy. The farmer, the agricultural student, or the botanists who wish to be able to identify any conspicuous or useful weedy or injurious grass of his neighborhood requires nothing more than this and the Manual of Botany covering his region. The following are the current manuals. From Maine to Virginia and west to Minnesota and Missouri inclusive, Gray's New Manual of Botany, 7th edition, 1908, Grasses by A.S. Hitchcock. Britain's Manual of Flora of the Northern States and Canada, 3rd edition, 1907, Grasses by G.V. Nash. Extending west to the western boundary of Kansas and Nebraska. Britton and Brown's Illustrated Flora of the Northern United States, Canada, and the British Possessions, a 2nd edition, 1913, 3 volumes, Grasses by G.V. Nash in Volume 1. From North Carolina to Florida and west to Oklahoma and Texas, Small's Flora of the Southeastern United States, 1903, Grasses by G.V. Nash. The Rocky Mountain region and east to the Black Hills of South Dakota, Coulter and Nelson's New Manual of Botany of the Central Rocky Mountains, 1909. This does not cover the Mexican flora that extends into the southern New Mexico and Arizona. Rydberg's Flora of the Rocky Mountains and Adjacent Plains, 1917. There is no manual covering the flora of the Southwest, but Wooten and Standley's Flora of New Mexico, Contributions United States National Herbarium, Volume 19, 1915, includes also most of the species of Arizona. This work gives keys to the genera and species and descriptions of the genera, but not of the species. California, Jepson's Flora of California, 1912, Grasses by A.S. Hitchcock. Washington, Piper's Flora of the State of Washington, Contributions United States National Herbarium, Volume 11, 1906, giving keys but not descriptions, Piper and Beatty's Flora of the Northwestern Coast, 1915, with keys and descriptions, and Piper and Beatty's Flora of the Southeastern Washington and Adjacent Idaho, 1914, with keys and descriptions. Oregon, Utah, and Nevada, and most of Idaho are not yet covered by manuals, but manuals of adjoining regions include most of the species. Besides these general manuals, there are Hitchcock's Textbook of Grasses, 1914, with illustrations, treating of economic grasses and their uses, and also of the morphology and the classification of grasses. Grasses of Iowa, Part 2, by Pamel, Ball, and Scribner, Iowa Geological Survey Supplementary Report 1905, with keys, descriptions, and illustrations. Grasses of Illinois by Edna Mosher, University of Illinois Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin 215, 1908, with keys, descriptions, and illustrations, Manual of Farm Grasses by A.S. Hitchcock, 1921. A helpful little bulletin is Lyman Carrier's Identification of Grasses by Their Vegetative Characters, Bulletin 461, United States Department of Agriculture, to be obtained from the Superintendent of Documents, Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C. for 5 cents. One should always have the inflorescence for accurate identification, but there are occasions when one would be glad to identify a seedling if possible. One who finds interest and delight in the study of grasses will want to accumulate a working library. A bibliography of even the most important works would be too long to be included here, and would be out of place in a first book of grasses. However, it may be well to mention a number of papers on grasses that have been issued in the past few years by the United States Department of Agriculture and the United States National Herbarium, which can be purchased for a small amount from the Superintendent of Documents, or the few out of print from dealers in second-hand books. Botanical names. In the introduction, the reasons were given for using Latin names of plants. It will have been noticed that these names are made up of 2 words, the generic name, a noun, and the specific, an adjective or a noun in the possessive case in opposition, and that the generic name is placed first, like the surnames of persons in a directory. Both words of the name are generally supposed to refer to some characteristic or property of the plant to which it is applied, as leptorus, slender tall, cylindricus, cylindric, and erianthus, woolly flower, saccharoides, like saccharum, that is, sugarcane. But often botanical names do not fit any better than do the names of persons. Paul, meaning small, baker, maybe a tall blacksmith, or Martha, meaning bitter, stern, may be sweet and gentle. Many of the Linnaean genera bear the ancient classic Greek or Latin names, such as quercus for oak, and ulmus for the elm. In many other cases, Linnaeus used classical names, but applied them not as anciently used, but to a different group. Bromus to the Greeks was the oat, but Linnaeus used it for the brome grasses. Zizanian was the Teres, supposed to be Lolium temulentium, sown by the enemy among the wheat in the parable of the Scripture. But Linnaeus used the feminine form of the word for our wild rice. On the whole, however, botanical names are more or less descriptive, and it is helpful as well as interesting to be mindful of their meaning, especially of the names of species. Any plant with the name asper or scabber will be rough in some part. Pubescens will be hairy. Alba will have white flowers or bark, probably, and rubra red. The name Bromus secalinus implies that the species was a weed in the rye, Sessile fields of Europe, as it is in our wheat fields. Holcus halepensis was known in the early ages from Aleppo, Halab, in Syria, and Phalaris canariensis from the Canary Islands. The present system of botanical nomenclature dates from 1753, when Linnaeus's Species Plantarum was published using binomials, names of 2 words for all the species. Before this, plants were given phrase names more or less descriptive, such as panicum with lax drooping panicle, the sheaths of leaves pubescent, for prosomillet, Panicum miliaceum, or grass with a very long spike like cattail for Timothy. These phrase names were in Latin, of course. Linnaeus's binomial plan so simplified the hitherto cumbersome system that it was everywhere adopted in less than a generation. In botanical works, it will be noted that plant names are followed by the initial abbreviation or the full name of a person, as Poa pratensis L. phragmites communis trin. This stands for the name of the person who gave the plant its name, L for Linnaeus, Trin for Trinius. It has often happened that the same species has been given different names by men working in various places and not in touch with each other. In such cases, the name first given is now the one generally used. It has also happened that 2 species in a genus have been given the same name. In this case, the name stands for the earlier one and the second is renamed. These superabundant names constitute what is termed synonymy. Synonyms are 2 or more names for the same thing. Superabundant names are also due to the fact that many species, when first described, were placed in genera to which more intensive study shows they do not belong. Triodia flava, for example, was first named Poa flava by Linnaeus, and Danthonia spicata was named Avena spicata by him. When these species are placed in Triodia and Danthonia respectively, the names of the original author is given in parentheses, with the name of the abbreviation of the person who made the change following it. Thus, Triodia flava, L. Hitchcock, Danthonia spicata, L. Deasy. Classification of plants. As stated in the introduction, page 2, the classification of grasses is based on the characters of the spikelet. The classification of plants is itself but a human attempt to show natural relationship, and the attempt is based on knowledge of but an infinitesimal part of the plant kingdom. The plants occupying the earth today are the survivors of millions of generations. Countless forms of these have become extinct. Some of these are known from fossils, but far more have vanished, leaving no record. Linnaeus said, "Nature never makes jumps." Connecting links exist, or have existed, between the greatest extremes. When no such link is known, we conjecture that the missing intermediates are among the countless extinct forms. Human minds approaching a given problem from various angles form different conjectures. Hence it is that botanists of different periods, or even of the same period, have diverse ideas of relationships. The species that Linnaeus described under Poa, for example, are today recognized as belonging in 3 genera and his species of Panicum in 9 genera. As vastly greater numbers of plants are known today, botanists have wider knowledge on which to base conclusions, but the main difference between Linnaean and present-day idea of genera is due to the modern concept of a genus as a network of related species, as contrasted with the earlier concept of genus as a sort of receptacle built of certain characters and open to any species having those characters. Linnaeus's idea of Cenchrus, for example, was primarily a genus of burr grasses, and besides what is now recognized as Cenchrus, represented by figures 70 and 71, he included in it a species of Natsea, figure 54, and a Mediterranean grass in which the burr is composed of the rigid lobes of the lemmas of the dense head of spikelets, as well as a plant that is not a grass. This brief explanation is offered to save the beginner from undue bewilderment when he finds, in using different books, that the standard excuse offered by botanists of all times and places that the Latin names of a plant is the same throughout the world is not as true as could be wished. It will be noted in using botanical works that certain characters are accepted as generic, that is, as indicating that species having these characters in common belong to a single genus. Such are the five-nerved keeled lemmas of Poa. Other characters, sometimes quite as conspicuous, such as the pubescence or want of it in Poa, and the presence or absence of an awn in Broma or Festuca, are regarded as specific, that is, as differentiating species. It might seem as though by some revelation certain characters are known to be generic and others to be specific. Such is not the case. A species consists of a group of individuals presumably capable of freely interbreeding. A genus is a group of species which, in the sum total of their characters, are so much alike as to warrant the assumption that they have had a common ancestor. Characters taken as generic and specific are analogous to theories or working hypotheses. We use them as far as they work. If they do not work, we discard them for other characters. Botany is a science of living things, and its problems can never be settled once and for all. It is this enduring interest that makes it so fascinating. Position of grasses in the plant kingdom. Flowering plants, excluding the pines and their allies, fall into two rather distinct groups. One, monocotyledons, characterized by an embryo having a single cotyledon, and by stems having woody fibers not in layers but distributed through them, as seen in the cornstalk, and not increasing by thickness with age. And 2. Dicotyledons, with an embryo having two cotyledons and stems with their woody fibers forming a zone between pith and bark and increasing in thickness by annual layers. Cotyledons are the seed leaves. Anyone will have observed that sprouting corn, rye, and other grasses send up a single leaf first, while squash, radishes, lettuce, and morning glories, for example, have a pair of opposite seed leaves. Grasses belong to the first class, with sedges, rushes, lilies, and the like. They form a highly specialized family with a greater number of species than any other, except the orchids and the composites, asters, dandelions, thistles, and their kinds. Grasses have been so successful in the struggle for existence that they have a wider range than any other family, occupying all parts of the earth and exceeding any other in the number of individuals. They reach the limits of vegetation, except for lichens and algae, in the polar regions, and on mountaintops endure both cold and torrid desert conditions, form the main part of the vegetation of the vast prairies, plains, savannas, and steppes of both hemispheres, and occupy great stretches of marsh and tide flats where they are building up dry land. Bamboos, the largest of grasses, form extensive forests and dense jungles. Grasses range in height from less than an inch, full grown, to over 100 feet, and they have developed all manners of contrivances for the dissemination of their seeds. Grasses in relation to man. Of all plants, grasses are by far the most important to man. The grains of wheat, barley, rye, oats, rice, corn, sorghum, and millet form the staple food of the greater part of mankind, while the animals that furnish wood and labor, wool, mohair, and leather live principally on grasses. The grains are also sources of starch, alcohol, and glucose. Sugar and syrup are obtained from sugarcane and varieties of sorghum, and of late years enormous quantities of cooking oil are secured from the germ of corn. Grasses furnish the material for brooms and brushes, and are an important source of fiber for paper making and cordage. Tons of essential oils are used in perfumeries, annually extracted from grasses. In the great part of Asia and Oceania, bamboo forms the principal or only timber for buildings and bridges and furnishes the material for all manner of tools, utensils, and furniture. The end.